Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Terry Gallagher. I want to welcome you back to another episode of Come and See. And if you remember, we're in the middle of a little side trip. We've taken our technical resource, Project Drawdown, and we put it aside for a 3-part episode on exploring the 3 urgent tasks that we have to do in this time. And this is the second episode, so we're going to focus on the second urgent task, which is grief. Actually, it's guiding our grief. It's providing a way to deal with the grief that has to be dealt with because we're ending one era and sacrificing some of the benefits that we enjoyed from that era of cheap fossil fuels to go to another era. And that means some things must die. You know, we don't like to talk about grief. In fact, in our modern society, we often pretend that nobody's going to die. And yet Scripture often speaks to the necessity of this. And the books that we're using for this section, Walter Brueggemann's Reality, Grief, and Hope, and Jim Mantell's Climate Church and Climate World, says that you have to grieve. Jim says that the smoke of grief cannot be separated from the fire of love. You have to have both. Walter Brueggemann says that we have to work through our grief in order to get to the future. Scripture speaks of it. One of the most poignant sayings was coming to us out of 2 Samuel, where King David is mourning the loss of his son. He says, Absalom, Absalom, if only I could have died instead of you. The future we're currently condemning our kids to, we're going to be wailing those same laments. And so it's really important to engage in the grief process, to provide a safe space, a hospitable space, a climate to embrace the grief. You know, there's been a number of different models for the different stages that we go through in grief. You know, and we're not all the same, so we don't go through grief in all the same ways. And we certainly don't go through and following the numbers. We'll bounce back and forth as we go through stages. But the first thing to deal with is shock. The shock that the way we've been living is causing the destruction of our planet. That's a shock. None of us intended this to happen. None of us purposely said, we're going to burn all of this oil and coal and gas so that it can destroy our kids' future. None of us wanted that to happen. But in truth, we didn't think about our consequences. We didn't think what would happen if we increased the pollution level 6-fold. We didn't think it through. In fact, we denied that it's happening. We denied that there was a limit to how much we could pollute. We pretended that smokestacks and exhaust pipes were a good thing. And because of that, we brought the life systems of the planet into jeopardy. And so we need to process through this grief. We have to acknowledge right up front, there will be a loss. This era has to die. There will be losses. One of the mistakes that many of my colleagues in the environmental justice movement make is denying how much loss there will be. And so they go through stages of grief just like this, where you deny the extent where you bargain. Well, maybe if we have a little bit of a carbon tax, things won't be so bad. We don't have to give up so much. People are dying right now from the climate crisis. 6 to 8 million people a year die from the pollution alone, and now hundreds of thousands are starting to die because of the starvation and because of the floods and the storms and the migration crisis and the wars that come about because of that. There is loss, yes. There's a loss when we got to think about that we can no longer jump in the car on a whim and take a trip for no reason, without considering what is the effect of that exhaust pipe spewing the pollution. There's a loss when we think about that we can no longer, with a clear conscience, just jump on a plane whenever we want or go on a cruise. we have to look at what is the impact of that. And so it's all right to grieve. In fact, it's critical to grieve that we now have to shed that way of life and come to a way of life where we embrace a way of life that does not destroy the future for our kids. But to get to that, to get to the new era, we have to go through a death and dying and a grieving process. You know, as a pastor, I have been with families a number of times when someone is nearing the end of life. And one of the tragedies is family members often refuse to see that. They refuse to speak about that publicly. They hold out for one last second miraculous cure, and they miss the opportunity to be truly present with the person who's dying. In fact, I've seen families that made the loved one linger on instead of giving them permission to go. We need to allow this current system, way of life based on burning oil and coal and gas to die. We have to give it permission to go. We have to withdraw the approval for companies to make a profit off of the destruction of the earth. We have to allow ourselves to grieve so that we can move through this period of grief and loss to embrace a new way of life, so that we can embrace this world that God has given into our care and find a new way to live, which we touch upon all the time in Project Drawdown. The technologies exist, we just need to embrace them. In the book of Revelations, one of the last chapters, it's pictured that God is on God's throne. It says, "See, I've made a new heaven and a new earth, for old ways have passed away, and I've made all things new." So we need to take time to grieve. We need to allow ourselves to talk about just the extent of the loss that we're experiencing. Because it's through working through the stages of grief that we finally come to an acceptance and we can embrace a new way of life. Can we do this? For the sake of my kids and your kids and my grandkids and your grandkids and their peers across the globe, we must do this. And with God's help, we can. I'll see you next time on Come and See, where we'll explore the third segment of these episodes, which is the urgent task of hope. See you then.
And faith is not in knowing, it's a willingness to learn. And faith is found in loving when there's nothing in return. So come and see, around the bend, look my friend, and what could be? Come with me, come with me. There's so much more to know, so come and see. There's so much more to know, so come and see.